Patreon. Welcome to our late July crowdcast for 2021. We have here today a returning guest, William Short of Hurstwic, and I'm saying it the way you do this time, who has recently published a new book with Rainier A. Oskarsson, Men of Terror, a comprehensive analysis of Viking combat, a subject that I know interests a lot of people. So if you would like to kick us off by just telling us a little bit about the book, why don't we do that?
Okay, I'd be happy to. And if your guests do not mind, what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes sort of laying the groundwork for the book and then just opening it up to questions. And we can talk about whatever is most interesting to your guests. First of all, the obligatory, here's the cover for the book. It should be available September 1, 2021. So in just a month. I'd like to start by explaining the title, Men of Terror. It takes its title from a memorial runestone. It's number DR216 in the runestone database. And it's a memorial raised to a man named Thrythi. It's hard to interpret the runestone. It's obscure, but it appears to say that Thrythi died in Sweden, and that he was the first among Vikings, and he was a terror of men. And so we wanted to understand people like Thrythi. What was it that caused him to be so admired yet still be a terror of men? It was clearly a violent society, and we see that in the picture stones and in their law codes and in their stories and in their art, and even in things like the architecture of their homes. And this violence created a twisted society with conflicting ideas and ideals. And we believe that you cannot understand Viking society unless you understand Viking combat. And so that's why we wrote this book, to put a human face on people like Thrythi, but primarily to create something that we do not think has been done before, to create a holistic picture of what Viking combat is about. We're not looking for the most efficient way to use Viking weapons. We're seeking the Viking way to use Viking weapons, and that's something very different. Simply because a move is effective in the training room or in the reenactment arena does not make that a move that Vikings might have used. Theories on edged weapon combat are difficult to test. I mean, if your idea about how to use an edged weapon is successful, then you kill your opponent, which today is not such a good thing. We can't do that in our research lab. So we need to come up with some way of testing our theories. And the way that many people test these theories is with some sort of simulated combat, some sort of arena of sort with rules. And this rules creates a platform, a constraint, and they can generate a lot of progress working within this constraint, but they'll always be constrained. And so as we started our research, we had to find a different way of testing Viking combat and researching Viking combat that allowed us to break through these constraints. And also to prevent our modern ideas about combat from affecting our thinking and our research on Viking combat. We have to keep our modern mindset very clearly out of the picture. And so, what it ends up being, it's not the clothes or the weapons that make someone a Viking warrior. It's the way that that person wields their weapons that makes them a Viking warrior. So in the book, we've tried very hard to create this holistic picture, and three main points emerge. And the book has 5 sort of introductory chapters that really push this, that explain our research, how we did it, our approach to it, and how we came to our conclusions and the basis of the conclusions. And the first is a chapter on our research method. And you and I talked about this in our first crowdcast interview, which was spring last year. And the second is the sources we use for our research. And the remaining 3 chapters are what we believe are the 3 pillars of Viking combat. One of them is mindset, which is in essence the software that controls human behavior. Number 2 is empty hand combat, the kind of combat you do when you do not have a weapon in your hand. And the last one is something about weapons, weapon preparedness, and how one uses those weapons. And so I am happy to talk about any of these points and go into detail on any of these topics, whatever it is your guests would like to hear about.
All right. Well, could you go in a little bit more into the mindset part to begin with?
Sure.
What critically distinguishes, say, a Viking warrior from some other kind of warrior or fighter in another culture?
Okay, I'll be happy to. It's how to put it. It's a multifaceted area. The way we have always thought about mindset is that it's like a computer system where the body, the human body, is the hardware, and you have some operating system, some low-level functions in the lower brain that control things like respiration and so on. And then there's this software that actually controls your behavior that you use to decide what you're going to do, how you're going to behave, and that we think is the mindset. In the Viking Age, mindset involved many aspects. So many things were brought to bear to determine mindset. Things like law codes, things like magic, things like societal norms, things like mythology, and many others. And we think it's the key to understanding how Vikings fought. So the way that we try to describe it, the way that we try to fill in some of the blanks is first this concept of drengur. Drengur is what everyone in the Viking Age aspired to be. And that word has been debated for a long, long time, and a lot has been written about it. What does this really mean? And so an important part of our research is trying to figure out what this word means. And it seems to mean a trustworthy man, someone you can trust, someone that you know will stand by your side in a violent conflict to the bitter end. And that's very valuable to know. That person would be a very valuable person to have at your side in a violent society where conflict is routine. It's important to know who you could trust. So a drengur was the ideal. And at the opposite extreme, not the opposite is the wrong word. The other extreme was a nidingur, someone who could not be trusted, but it's not the opposite of drengur. There's a different word for that. A nidingur was a despised outcast, but also it had the sense of a curse, like you could place nidh on someone, like you might curse them. So it's not quite the opposite. And this is an example of something we call using layered sources, something we do again and again and again in our book. Not just using single sources, not just using a few sources, but putting layer on top of layer on top of layer of sources. And we look at these with varying magnifications. And it's important enough, I'd like to take a short detour and talk about that a little bit.
Of course.
For instance, we might use eyeglasses and look at sort of normal magnifications and layer, for instance, literary sources on top of archaeological sources, and then put etymology on top of that, trying to build up a strong structure that gives us some understanding. And then we might go to a stronger magnifier, maybe a magnifying glass, and we might layer one particular type of source. So for instance, sagas on top of runestones, on top of Eddas, on top of Saxo Grammaticus, and so on. And then we might zoom in even tighter using like a microscope to look at, various types of the same source, like layering one saga on top of another saga on top of another saga to really drill down and understand what's going on, to really give us a clear picture. And what we're looking for is the common thread, the similarities. So all of these sources, all these layered sources should point in the same direction. So if we have a whole bunch that point this way and one that points this way, we've got to stop and figure out what's going on. What's happening here is this one source that's a little bit, that's askew. Maybe what that tells us is that our thinking, our hypothesis is not correct. If we layer all these sources and they collapse, it says, maybe we're not doing it right. Maybe our hypothesis is wrong. We'll throw it away and we'll start again. Maybe what it says is this one source that points in a different direction is faulty in some way, or perhaps misinterpreted. And a perfect example of that was in our research of this empty hand combat. we had built up this very strong structure using a variety of sources. And then we came across this small wooden figure, carved wooden figure of two men grappling. And it's in a museum in Norway, and it was thought to date from around the 11th century, so perfect for Viking age. But it didn't fit. Everything pointed this way, but this figure pointed that way. So it really stopped our research completely, and we had to think about it a lot. And so finally what we did was we contacted the people at the museum. Could you please reevaluate this artifact? And they did, and they came back a little while later saying, no, it's not from the Viking Age, it's much younger, it's modern era, and it's probably from the 19th century. So something that once we thought was vital to understanding empty-hand combat now has no bearing on Viking combat. So this one thing, basically we changed history with this research. And then, of course, the last possibility, if we have hundreds and hundreds that I'll point this way, hundreds and hundreds of sources, and only one or two or three that point the other way, maybe we just have outliers. Maybe these are things that we simply have to discard because there's something off about them. So as we do this, we're trying to build up this common thread to create the holistic picture. So when we were trying to understand this mindset, this drengr, this niðingur thing, and what these words really meant, we ended up depending on, first of all, really detailed reading of every literary source that we could get our hands on that was related to the Viking Age, and then creating graphical sources derived from this that would allow us to really dig deep into the meaning. Like, you know, what were the causes of need, for instance? Well, we have graphical data that tells us in this based on our detailed reading of the literary sources. You know, what actions were taken? What did you have to do as someone in the Viking Age? If someone implied that you were needed, what did you have to do? How swiftly did you have to do it? And what was the outcome of those actions? And again, it's this deep research into all these sources that was critical. Something else I'd like to mention about the book, you know, having these sources available, we think are really valuable to the reader, and especially anyone doing research that follows up on what we've done. So the book has literally thousands of endnotes that detail all of our sources, all of the additional information that we didn't put in the text. So someone who wants to follow this and dig deeper will have that information readily available to them. Anyway, jumping back to the mindset, I apologize for that lengthy detour, but jumping back into the mindset, we have drengr, niðingur, and the other thing that is critical to understand is orðstír. The word is a little complex. The literal translation is word glory. It's that people talk about you and mention your name not only during your life, but after you are dead. And Havamal tells us it is the only part of you that is immortal. It does not die. And so people did whatever it took to gain orðstír. And combat was often about gaining orðstír. And going back to the example of Friday, the man on the memorial stone, clearly he had orðstír. Here it is, 1,000 years after his death, and we're still speaking his name and talking about him. So a clear example of a man who achieved orðstír. Basically, a drengr fights to the end and beyond to obtain that orðstír. So there's other aspects of mindset as well. Virðing and sæmd, which translates roughly to worth and to fame, but is more complex than that, of course. And other aspects come into play, like magic and fate and luck and so on. So Viking mindset is very different than ours today. And if we want to understand Viking culture, we need to understand that mindset. And an example I sometimes like to use, like in the Viking Age, it was okay to burn a man alive in his house, but it was horrific to murder him. And so understanding that difference is important.
Right. And what murder means, which is not what we call it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So actually, as you were saying that, Payson asked, and I think you have somewhat answered this during the time that since it was asked, have you identified other possible values which define drengr other than steadfastness and loyalty, maybe in opposition to what it's not? If you're looking at niðingur, and you were, I think, just touching on this.
Yes. Yeah.
A certain reckless courage is something I think about.
Okay. We think it's more than that. It's yes, you need courage, you need all of these events, but we think it boiled down to is this was a man you could count on, even more than a loyal dog who stays at your side until your death. This was a man that you could turn to, regardless of the circumstances, who would be at your side. And it's important to have people like that around you in a society where an armed attack could take place at any time with no warning. So it's trustworthiness, or not. Yeah, I guess so. Trustworthiness is probably the best way to put it in our mind.
Makes sense. And Chris mentions he'd like to hear a rundown of the other two major categories too from the book. So the unarmed combat and armed combat.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that.
And one thing I'd like to start you on and talking about that is when you mention unarmed combat, my mind quickly turns to Glima, modern Icelandic traditional wrestling. How much of that is in continuous tradition with Viking Age combat?
Okay, I'd be happy to talk about that. And thank you, Chris, for the question. It's a perfect segue. That was what I'd love to talk about next. So the other two pillars, empty hand combat, that's combat without a weapon in hand, even though you might pick up a weapon to finish the fight. Today we might call it grappling or wrestling. In the Viking Age, it was called both Glima and Funk. It's a power-based empty hand fighting system. And it's really the only sport that has survived from the Viking Age into today. And I'm using the English word sport to mean the Old Icelandic word íþróttur, and modern Icelandic as well, which not only has the meaning of sport, but also has the meaning of accomplishment. Something you do to make your name, to gain fame. And sports is one of the ways of doing that. Now, Glima is still practiced today as the modern sport of Iceland, and it has a nearly unbroken written record from today all the way back to the Viking Age. And my co-author, Reynir, has really led the charge in pursuing that research, deep into the archives in Icelandic libraries and manuscript libraries to make these connections. The basis of Viking Age Glima was strength. It was all about strength. So when a man was asked to demonstrate his strength, he questioned, "Are you asking me to Glima?" That was the way of showing strength. And another example, Grettis Saga. The author says that no one knew Grettir's real strength because he was not a wrestler. He was not a Glima man. And this shows how important that Glima was the way of determining strength. It was a power-based fighting system. And in this kind of grappling, everything must be done at full strength. So a move that you make at less than full strength is not likely to succeed. And your opponent is likely to take advantage of you. So this is another example of layered sources. If the empty hand combat points in a different direction than the armed combat, probably something is wrong. It makes sense that the armed combat, like the empty hand combat, would be power-based, all power-based. And so the armed combat, we believe, was all about power. It was about brute force. It was an attack with the intent of cleaving your opponent in two. You think about this, a weak attack, maybe it might kill your opponent, but it's not going to get you any Orstir. No one's going to talk about the fact that you tapped this guy and that was enough to cause his death. What they want to hear, what's going to cause your name to be remembered, is this magnificent full power attack that takes off the head or slices the torso in two or takes off a limb. That's the kind of attack that's going to give you Orstir. That's the kind of attack that we believe Vikings used with their weapons. So these power-based attacks are consistent through many sources, even in archaeological evidence. One of my favorites is these kettle skulls that were found at the farm at Hurstwic in North Iceland. This was most likely a chieftain's house. These kettle skulls were ritually slaughtered with powerful blows, and then the skulls were displayed outdoors for many years, is the interpretation of these finds. These skulls were not slaughtered with light movements. These were insanely powerful attacks, most likely with an axe, to cause the kind of damage that we see in these skulls. And so all of this fits together, this ritual slaughter, the weapons combat, the empty hand combat. It's power-based. Viking Age combat is power-based. It's all about attempting to split the opponent in two, if at all possible, to gain that Orth Steel. And then the last topic was, weapons and what I call weapon preparedness. It's strongly supported by the Mindset chapter that basically you want to be prepared as a Viking. You want to be prepared for violence all the time. You want to be prepared to defend against violence, and you want to be prepared to dish out violence when it's needed on a moment's notice. And Havamal has multiple verses that talk about the need for this, about the need not to move more than a footstep away from your weapon, or the need that when you enter a room, look behind the door because there might be an enemy hiding behind there. And we see this kind of preparedness in many sources, literary sources, archaeological sources, and many, many more. One aspect of this is keeping your weapon sharp. Vikings admired sharp weapons, and we see that again and again in the literary sources. We see that sharpness in the archaeological finds. Some of these swords, even though they've been in the ground for 1,000 years, are still extremely sharp. A key part of this preparedness is the idea of improvisation in a fight. Basically, you do whatever you need to do to win the fight. You use whatever is available in the environment. And that's often seen in Glima. For instance, there are these wrestling stones that you use during a wrestling match to break your opponent's back by breaking him over these stones. Some of these stones still exist today. So, for instance, you can go see the stone Hrigbjörtur, which is in Hringsdalr in West Iceland, a stone that the literary sources tell us was used for breaking the back. And for instance, another literary example is in Grettir's saga. Grettir used a wooden beam that was set into the floor of the house as a brace when he was wrestling. And in general combat, we see this kind of improvisation as well. The king of weapons, we believe, in the Viking Age is something that you and I talked about in our last discussion last fall, and that is the thrown stone. People would throw stones during battle, whether that be land battles, naval battles, whatever it was. You improvise, you use what's available, and that could be a stone that you pick up. In fact, battle locations would be chosen based on the availability of stones for throwing. And before a naval battle, you would stop your ship, go to shore, and pick up more stones to use in the upcoming naval battle. So basically, this improvisation is you just do whatever it is you need to do that is consistent both with delivering power and ending the fight as a drengur. Okay.
And certainly in the sagas, you mentioned about improvisation. I think about fights like Gunnar of Hlíðarendis in Njál's saga aboard the Viking ship when he's attacked by other Vikings, and there's quite a bit of improvisational weapons and then weapons taken from someone else and used against them, and that happens in Hervar saga and Hilts too. Yeah, that's I had never thought of that as being a crucial element. Two questions have come up in the time you're answering that question. One was Payson asked if Glima was used in the context of Thor wrestling Etli in the Hall of Utgard the Loki. I don't believe that word is used in the Old Norse text, but it certainly seems consistent with the actions of Glima. I've looked at the Old Norse text pretty recently.
Yeah. I wonder if the word used is funk, which is another
I'm pretty sure it is.
Word. Yeah.
I mean, I can check this. I can check this while you talk about the next thing. Loriana asks, there are many swords in the sagas that have become mythical. Do you think that is because with all the labor used to make a sword, if you make one that withstands battle, they're regarded as almost magical?
Okay, so that is a perfect segue to another thing that I'd very much like to discuss for all of you watching this. Swords. There is a chapter in the book for each type of Viking weapon. And the swords is especially interesting. They're an especially interesting weapon. And we think we've come up with some new research and some new results that shine more light on what Viking swords were and what they meant to the people who used them. Some people today think that Viking swords were rare in that era, something sort of exotic, like maybe a Ferrari would be today, something that would be reserved for the elite. But what we have discovered is that both the literary evidence and the archaeological evidence dispute that. There's a huge number of Viking swords found that are being held by various museums around Scandinavia, like nearly as many as axes and spears. So it's clear that this was not something super elite. This was just another Viking weapon. But a sword incorporates all the aspects that Vikings prized. It had power, it had cunningness, and it had speed. And the reason for that is that swords have a capability not found in any other Viking weapon, and that is maneuverability. The fact that you can start the sword on its swing and change its path easily in mid-flight, and this you cannot do with other weapons. They were the technological marvels of their time. And we have made like mathematical models, computer models of swords to understand this capability and to be able to compare them with other weapons and understand exactly what their capabilities were in the ideal case. And then we can go to our research lab and use physical weapons and try some of this and understand what it is that makes them the way they are. Verify our computer models, if you will, with some practical use of the weapons. And another aspect of the weapon that is fascinating is the importance of the hilt. So basically where you hold on to the sword. It's first of all, in the Viking Age, that seems to be the important part of the sword. That is what identified an individual sword. So you would say that's Gunnar's sword because you saw the hilt, and his hilt was different than someone else's hilt. So it was the hilt that identified the sword. And as your status in life improved, you made changes to the hilt. You renewed the hilt, you changed the hilt, and interestingly, you tuned the performance of the sword by making changes to the hilt. And again, by understanding the physics and the mathematics of the weapon, we have a more clear understanding of how that's done, how that works. So for instance, if you go look at a collection of historic Viking Age swords and start picking them up with the appropriate safeguards, picking them up and swinging them, you see that there is a wide range of feel, the way the weapon feels in the hands. Some swords, and please excuse me, sometimes I get a little romantic here, but some of these swords just leap into the hand and become an extension of the swordsman's own arm and just fly through the air with very little need to guide them physically. They just are an extension of the arm. Others, you pick them up and it seems like they are trying at every possible moment to hinder you. They just want to fall to the floor. And now we understand what those differences are and why some warriors might choose one rather than the other. At first, our thought was, oh, okay, well, this clumsy one was the work of an incompetent smith, but I don't think so anymore. It's clear that one type of fighter might prefer one weapon and another type of fighter might prefer another. Someone who is all about this cunning, this trickiness, would go for the quick and responsive sword, and the other swordsman who is all about powerful cleaving in two might go for this cleaving type of sword. And we understand now how it is possible to change one type of sword into another type of sword. Maybe not completely, but at least fine-tune it by changing the nature of the hilt and how the hilt is designed. So it's really a fascinating topic with a lot of new insight that we discuss in the book.
And these differences between hilts, are they, I mean, is it roundedness versus squaredness? Is it a thickness? Is it a length? What's...
It's a weight distribution, weight, length
Oh,
distribution.
weight.
So yeah, what we're trying to do is without going into the physics, which I'm not sure that I don't think your viewers are much interested in, but it's the physical term is moment of inertia, how quickly you can get the sword rotating, or how easily you can get the sword rotating, or how much it resists your ability to rotate it. And you can fine tune that moment of inertia. And not only does it affect its responsiveness, but it also affects its ability to deliver destructive energy into the target. So one aspect of our computer models is how much destructive energy does this blow deliver into the target? And again, all these things are interrelated and you can fine tune them all.
I see. And so, for example, a heavier hilt is going to put, well, I'm trying to think of what the results here might be. A lighter hilt might let the sword swing faster, I guess, depending on how you were swinging it. And then Payson points out possibly the weight of the pommel has something to do with that. That's very interesting. I would never have expected that.
Yeah, and it's not so much weight per se, it's really the distribution along the length of the sword. It's a system, it's a complete system. So if you look at just the pommel, you're going to miss important points. If you look at just the length of the hilt, you're going to miss important points. If you look at just the center of balance of the whole sword, you're going to miss important points. It's a finely tuned system. And when it's done correctly, it moves responsively and it delivers energy to the destructive energy to the target. So it's a complex system.
And how are you measuring energy? Is this feet per second or something like that?
Yeah. So the physical measure would be joules, but a lot of this is in computer models where we are really trying to adjust the parameters to see what happens, and then we go to our research lab and actually measure it, where we hit a instrumented target with a sword and measure how much energy is being transferred. And one of the experiments we did was make a whole bunch of swords. I think it was 4. They all had exactly the same mass. They all had the same length, but they were all tuned in this way to have different parameters. One was a heavy hitting brute, one was lightweight, and 2 others were, midpoint between those 2, and they all behaved as the model predicted.
Interesting. Well, this really speaks to the importance of doing some physical experimentation and not just sort of speculating about why you might have one sword versus another. Yes. Because surely the people using these were physically experimenting with them, whether by chopping trees or chopping people, and using the data, that hard-won data, to decide what they were going to do. That's cool to think of them tinkering with them too, even after the manufacturing process.
Yes, the hilt was something that was, excuse me for interrupting, but the hilt was something that was constantly being renewed, because the hilt did wear out. It was the piece that you touched constantly. And in fact, there's evidence that that warriors would often walk around with their hand on their sword hilt by their side, and so it would wear even faster than you might think from the use. Their hand would constantly be on their sword hilt, so that would wear quickly. So it would be renewed on a regular basis. And we also have the sense that as people's status in society changed, as they rose, they would put better hilts on, more decorated hilts. And certainly when that was happening, they could tune the hilt to make the sword more like what they wanted.
Makes sense.
We find examples. We have examples in the archaeological record where the sword blade and the sword hilt are different in time period by 200, even 300 years. So the sword blade that was 200 years old had a new hilt fastened to it at some point.
Very interesting. It makes perfect sense. On the manufacturing end, Kim wanted to know, did they really use bones to harden the steel during the forging process?
Okay. It has been suggested. I'll be honest, it's not an area of expertise that I feel I have strong knowledge of. But having said that, I think it's unlikely, to be quite honest. And the reason I say that is phosphorus, which is found in bones, is not a good thing for making iron because it makes it brittle. Now, having said that, there's reasons to have some phosphorus in iron. And so it's possible, since some of these swords were made with multiple layers of different types of iron, and so perhaps one of the layer would have more phosphorus than the other, and perhaps the way to get that phosphorus was by adding bones. But to my knowledge, I do not have any evidence that suggests that bones were routinely added to making the iron used for swords.
Interesting. All right. And Payson asked, again on hilts and that part of a sword, what do you think about the small hand grips on swords bound? Have you come across Roland Varzeka's thoughts and drawings about the pommel laying on the heel of the hand and not held in a 90-degree hammer grip?
Yes. Okay. So one of the things we did for this book was try to create a distribution chart. How big is the actual grip of a Viking sword? Because yes, there are swords that have small grips, but the vast majority have grips that even a ham-fisted Viking would have no trouble holding onto, full-handed without resorting to some exotic grip. So, and that's what it shows, that the median grip size of well-preserved Viking swords from a large number of countries, something that we did for this book and something that's printed in the book, is 100 millimeters. So that's about 4 inches. 4 inches between the crossguard and the pommel. So that's no problem getting your hand around. That's no problem at all. Now there are some smaller, there are some larger, but the median is 4 inches. So suggesting exotic grips to make your hand fit doesn't seem necessary. In addition, we tested a lot of different grips. There's among the modern practitioners, a number have been proposed, but by golly, the one that delivers the most power to the target, based on our measurements, is the simple hammer grip. You just hold the sword like you hold a hammer. Nothing fancy about it at all. And that delivers quite a bit more power to the target than any of the other grips that we tested.
Well, that's, again, the value of experimental data. Kim also asked, is there evidence that hilts were treated to last, like with oil or lard put on the blades themselves to prevent rust? And what kind of oil or lard might have been found in the archaeological sources?
Okay. So I think there are two questions there, and I'll try to answer each one, but I'll try to answer them separately. So it was important to keep the blade from rusting. It was a constant problem. The iron that was used in these blades rusts pretty easily, and so you need to keep it oiled routinely. I'm not sure that there's been any archaeological finds of what type of oil was used. I have always speculated that it was probably fish oil. Perhaps it was something like lanolin from sheepskins. Many of the scabbards, not many, some of the scabbards that are found, and scabbards are rarely found that contain the sword and protect the sword, simply because they're all organic, and so everything rots away. But some have been found where there are traces of sheepskin that touches the sword. That's the innermost layer. And so the natural lanolin in the sheepskin would help keep the sword from rusting. And in fact, there are some blades that survive where you can see the actual pattern of the sheepskin etched into the blade. As the sheepskin rotted away, it etched its pattern into the blade. So yes, the blades themselves needed to be treated. Now, about the scabbards, about the hilts themselves, the hilts were primarily made up out of organic materials, so leather, wood, and so on. And so they mostly rot away, and we don't really have a clear idea of how they were constructed. We can speculate, and we can look at later medieval swords that have survived because they were never buried. And there's also examples of swords that are where the grip is wrapped with wire and the wire still survives. And even decorative plates on some of these grips. But any of these would probably not need an oil or a fat to keep it from rusting because it wasn't ferrous. It was organic. So rust would not have been an issue.
Makes sense. Cameron asked a question on a different tack. Is there any evidence of the physical toll that medieval combat took on those wielding the weapons, not just those on the receiving end? Swinging heavy metal implements quickly and precisely for hours at a time must have required considerable physical fitness.
Okay. It's an area of great interest to us. And first of all, it's important to remember that Viking society was an agricultural society. And so there was no powered machinery of any kind and not even much animal labor. Pretty much everything you needed to do on the farm you did with human labor. And so people were used to intense physical labor. And so when we look at skeletal remains of people from the Viking Age, that is exactly what we see. We see suggestions for strong, robust people all throughout society, not just the drudgery people at the bottom, but all throughout the society, people are strong and robust. And that comes into what we were talking about before about the importance of strength in this society. You wanted to show your strength. And strength was simply a part of everyday lives for these people because of the nature of their society. When we look at the bones, you see the places where the soft tissue, the muscles and tendons connect to the bones themselves, and those connections are super robust. It just tells us that these were strong people. When you look at things like joints, you see that they were subject to a lot of wear and tear. These were people doing physical work on a regular basis. So picking up a 2-pound sword and swinging that all day, that'd be nothing compared to what they would do for their agricultural chores all the time. But it brings up another question, and that is, how did these people train? How did someone learn how to use a weapon? And the simple answer is we have no idea. We really don't know. There is very little evidence about how these people trained to use weapons. There's only one form of weapon where training is clearly expressed, both in the literary sources and in the archaeological sources, and that's in archery. And perhaps because archery is much more technique driven than any of the other tools. So we have these practice arrows that are found in archaeology, these blunts. And we have many examples in the literary sources of people going to an archery range to train. And we have examples of archery trainers, people who are more skilled in archery than anyone else, and so they trained other archers. But when it comes to swords or axes or spears, we do not know. Well, certainly axes would be pretty routine because an axe can be used as a tool or a weapon. They were, a tool axe would be made differently, constructed differently than a weapon axe, but the idea is the same. But when it comes to a sword is only a weapon. It has no domestic use. How did someone learn to use it? And again, we don't really know. Our best guess is that a young child would learn from other family members, father, uncle, brother, something, but learn from other family members. And what we do find in the archaeological record, which is sort of interesting, is we find these child-sized weapons that are buried with children. Now, were they play toys? Were they training weapons? Were they actual weapons that size for a child? We don't know. Some of them are wood, some of them are iron. So again, we don't know, but it seems like children were exposed to these weapons at a very, very early age. And again, that's confirmed in some of the literary sources where, for example, Aet killed his first man as a boy in a game, and I forget what age he was, 8, I think, or 6 maybe, but a very young boy.
I think 7.
Someone,
Yeah.
6 or 7, yeah.
Well, and that actually connects to something Chris asked, techniques and training-wise, how they fenced, quote, with their swords. It sounds like we might not have great information about that, or do we?
Okay. So let's if I may, Chris, try to define some terms. Today, when we think of fencing, we think of sport fighting or training type of fighting. And I'm not sure that was a thing in the Viking Age. If it was, there's not very much evidence for it. And I can think of only one example where it says that men fenced. And what that was a mockery, actually. Two men pretended to be two people who were about to fight a duel in order to mock one of them. And that's the only example I can think of where men were fencing. It seems that when there was combat, it was serious combat. And when it was not serious combat, it was something totally different, like a sport or a game or something like that. So, for instance, one of the Viking games is the Viking ball game, Knotleker. And there's a lot of parallels between that and combat. No, it doesn't involve swords, but it does involve many of the aspects of combat. And perhaps that's the way they trained. Perhaps they trained in using axes every time they slaughtered an animal. If you were slaughtering a bull, which was a common occurrence on the farm in the Viking Age, because you did not let the bulls live very long, you wanted to kill the animal with the first blow because you did not want a wounded bull running around on the farm, that's for sure. So maybe that was another way to train. But again, we simply don't know. And if they fenced, there's just not very much evidence for it.
Right, because when you go out to use a weapon in actual life and death combat, you don't want that weapon hitting other weapons. You want that weapon hitting people, right?
Yes.
So it's a pretty different attitude than what you see in fencing competition, where you're expecting the weapons to hit other weapons a lot. And of course, as I understand it, they use shields quite a bit, which is
Yes.
different from the only thing in your hand being a sword. Yeah.
Yes.
Payson asks, and this I think kind of connects to that too, how much value have been the medieval sources for training with weapons? And I take that to mean medieval, later medieval, in figuring out weapon use in the Viking Age.
Okay. It's a good question, Payson. That is where Hurstwic started out. That is where we started out. My interest was the Viking Age. I found a group doing hemo research on Meyer's treatise from 1570. And I thought at least that would be a good place to start. And then later the Royal Armoury's 133, which is much closer to Viking times. And after spending some years studying these, eventually we had to discard them as not being applicable to Viking combat. And the reason is simply this. The mindset of the warriors was totally different. It wasn't just that the weapons had changed, which they had quite a bit between the Viking Age and the later medieval and Renaissance times, but it was the mindset had changed so much that the way that a Viking warrior would use his weapons was totally different than what these medieval and Renaissance fighters used. These combat manuals, these treatises, are all technique driven. That may be putting it too strong, but it's technique driven. And Viking combat, we do not believe, was about techniques at all. It had one goal: split the other fellow in two, destroy what is in front of you, and do it any way you want to do it, as long as you can walk away a Drenge. And so once we realized this, that the mindsets were so different, we had to discard using these later manuals.
I am surprised at that. Because I look at this as someone who's, well, not a medieval combatant. And I think, how much variation can there be in how you swing a sword at someone, right?
Yes.
But, and in fact, in grad school, I did some Arma, right? It's kind of related to HEMA. So that's interesting. That really surprises me. Kim asks, how much did Viking Age weapons and combat influence the cultures they had contact with, English, Irish, Spanish, French? So if styles are transferred over, did forging process or fighting styles get culturally transmitted to these other cultures?
Okay. The simple answer is not too sure. So the Vikings, of course, traveled extensively on their voyages of trading, raiding, exploration. They came into contact with a lot of other cultures. And how much of what they saw did they adopt? They certainly were clever people. There's a lot of evidence of that. So I would imagine that if they saw something that they thought would improve their ability to fight, they would pick it up quickly. But I think it is the case that most of the people they came in contact with had weapons that were very similar to the weapons that they had. So it wasn't like there was a lot of differences. Now, let's take a couple of examples. They had a lot of contact with the warriors from the east in the eastern part of the Viking countries, such as in Sweden, Berka being the perfect example, where there were a lot of warriors from Eastern Europe, which used different types of armor, used some different types of weapons. Did the Vikings adopt these? And right now, it's, in my mind, not too clear that they did. So for instance, the Eastern warriors use different type of armor, which we find lots of in Berka and almost none anywhere else. So maybe it wasn't widely adopted. The Eastern warriors, mounted warriors for the most part, whereas Vikings typically fought on foot, used bows for their archery that were quite different. Viking bows were basically long bows made out of a single piece of wood, and the Eastern bows were horn bows made out of a composite of horn and sinew and wood and other things. Did Vikings adopt that? And if they did, there's just not a lot of evidence. Clearly, they were aware of it because those words exist in the Viking language. And there are intriguing, really intriguing archaeological finds that say maybe yes, but there's just not enough to say that it was adopted, and certainly not in any wide sense that we have evidence for. So probably not. What we do see when we look at the writings of some of these other cultures that the Vikings came in contact with is, well, the admiration of these people for their bravery. We see that in their writings multiple times. And one of my favorite example is the Moors who were living in Spain and Portugal at this time wrote about the Viking raids in the Moorish lands there. And they say those Vikings, wretched Vikings, used fire arrows to set fire to the mosque in Seville, I think it was. And their ships were so much more superior than the Moorish ships. And so what the Moors did to counteract that was they built ships that mimicked in appearance the Viking ships, even though they didn't have the same sailing capabilities, so they could sail closer to the Viking ships without being detected and then engage them. And it's clear from their writings that they admired the bravery of the Vikings who were doing these raids.
That's interesting that Kim actually was asking about that as you started to talk about it, asking about the clash between the Vikings and Moors in Spain and how naval fighting styles helped to hurt them in these conflicts versus by land.
Yeah.
Is there much difference between, I think we actually talked about this a little bit the last time you were on, about naval fighting is essentially land fighting on boats.
Yes.
Is that
yes.
about right?
Yeah, that is a good way to put it. And anyone interested, I encourage you to look at the YouTube video of that. It was marred by some audio problems, but the information is there. But yes, a naval battle was basically a land battle fought on floating islands, which was the ships lashed together. And many of the same techniques, even some of the same formations and the same formation names, many of the same weapons. There were some specialized naval weapons, but many of the same weapons. And the goal was the same, to basically destroy your enemy, not destroy the ship, just the people. The ship was too valuable to destroy. You wanted to clear the decks, take the ship, cut it free, and move on to the next ship that was tied together in the line.
Makes sense. Well, and of course, makes a special sense with ships being valuable. Who knows how much labor and time it's a single one of those ships would take? I can't imagine. Vicky asks, and this is shedding into controversial territory a little bit, maybe there are too few of the possible women warrior burial sites like the one in Birka to make a generalization, but does it appear that women would use weapons comparable to those of men in terms of materials and weight, etc.? So if you want to wade into this this controversy?
All right. Chris, thank you for asking the question. It's not an area
Vicky.
I want to wade into, but I'm sorry, Vicky, I'm sorry. You read. But I will give it my best shot, and it is something we discuss in the book. Yes, there's not a lot of evidence about women warriors. The Old Norse term for that, skjaldmæður, which literally translates shield maiden. And these are people, numerous of these people are mentioned in multiple sources, not just sagas, but in other sources as well, that these women would become warriors. What seems to be consistent looking through all these sources, all these examples, is that first, these women were the daughters of kings or earls. Two, they trained early on. At some point early on, they saw that this was what they wanted to do. When they were ready, they took on all the characteristics of men in terms of changing their name to a masculine name, putting on men's clothing, and they were typically the leaders of a group of fighting men. It's also clear that typically at some point they decided this was no longer the life for them. And they reverted to women's clothing, to a woman's name, and to women's activity. And what these sagas and these sources often say is, and then they took up sewing once again. So this appears to be something that is commonly mentioned in the literary sources. But what archaeological sources do we have for this? Well, of course, there's the grave in Birka that has spawned so much press, both academic publications and popular press. And if I may, in a nutshell, it's a prominent warrior's grave that was excavated in the 19th century and always assumed to be masculine, a male buried there because of the weapons and so on and so forth, and especially the location of the grave. But when the bones were analyzed, they were the bones of a woman. So what does this mean? Was this a woman warrior? And right now, I think it is too soon to come to any conclusions. It really is. The bones are not well enough preserved to see any kind of battle injuries. The bones are not well enough preserved to know anything about the strength of the person or anything along those lines. So we simply do not know at this point. What is clear is that, for instance, the law codes prohibit women from carrying weapons. They could own weapons, they could use weapons, but they could not carry weapons. Using weapons was typically the job of the men in this society. So there is this disconnect. We also have these pictorial sources. We have these figures, often silver, of people dressed in women's clothing carrying shields. Is this a shield maiden? Well, it doesn't match up with what we know about shield maidens in the literary sources, because in the literary sources, they wear men's clothing. So again, we don't know. It's a topic that is still under investigation.
True. We've taken about an hour of your time at this point. Are you willing to take another question or two if someone else throws one in?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Chris asks, what did Christianity do to the traditional Viking mindset? I've been wondering about this while reading Heimskringla, reading about Christian kings raiding and pillaging all the way to Jerusalem.
Okay. Yes, without a doubt, the adoption of Christianity changed things, changed the mindset. And it was one of the contributing factors, not the only factor, but a contributing factor to the end of the Viking raids. And a contributing factor to the end of dueling as well. I should probably add here that raiding and dueling are very closely related. We think of them as sisters, really. And they are the only two activities that would get you called a Vikinger. You were called a Vikinger because you either did Viking raids or you were a dueler. And the law codes treat them typically in the same section and sometimes even in the same sentence. If you do dueling or raiding, this is what happens to you. So they're in the Viking line, they were very, very closely related. And both of them were against the teachings of the church. That's probably the best way to put it. It was not considered Christian to do either one of these things. And so duels were abolished both in Iceland and in Norway, according to the literary sources, shortly after Christianity was adopted. And the Viking raids sort of came to the end at a similar sort of time. There's one example, and I can't remember which saga hero it is, but he's talking to the king of Norway, and he is a very successful Viking raider. And the king, who is now converted to Christianity, is saying, you're very successful here, but this is against the teaching of the church. I'd like you to stop. And so he does. So it definitely changed the Viking society and the Viking mindset.
Of course, without eliminating warfare, right? You would still expect, I would still expect, you would think that for the first couple centuries after the conversion, there would be a strong continuity in terms of not only the material culture of weapons, but also, to the extent we can know about it, the techniques of fighting. Would you say there's more of a break there?
No. I would agree with you there, sir, 100%. There was very little that changed when Christianity was adopted, certainly short term, and it took a long time for major changes to occur in the society. It was quicker in some of the Scandinavian countries, much slower in Iceland, where it took centuries really before there were notable changes. So no sudden changes in the style of fighting, no sudden changes in the weapons, no sudden changes in the lifestyle. And something I always find fascinating, in Iceland, when Christianity was adopted, the only major change was the burial practices. They changed almost overnight from the normal heathen burial practices to Christian burial practices. And that seemed to be universal, but very little else changed.
Right. Well, so if how they're fighting, what they're fighting with isn't changing very fast, there's some initial changes in why they're fighting, if nothing else. Other questions before we call this a day? Let's see if anyone wants to throw something out here. I really appreciate you taking the time with us, and we'll look forward to the release of Men of Terror, a comprehensive analysis of Viking combat on September 1st, 2021.
Yes.
You want to hold up the book cover again so we can finish on that?
Yep. And
there we
for
go.
Those who would like to hear more, we do have a series of book lecture tours planned. The first one is in Iceland at the end of August, and we're planning some at least for the east coast of the U.S. later in the fall. So
very nice. Very nice. Excellent. We'll go to Hurstwic for more information about that and notifications about talks. And for now, again, thank you for your time, and I'll wish everyone well.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. All the best, everybody.